Hitler's hatred of the Jews bothered Hindenburg very deeply. And Hindenburg basically dismissed him and said, for the sake of God, my country, and my conscience, I would never appoint you as chancellor. Afterward, he allegedly quipped to someone that if he was to appoint Hitler as anything, it would be as postmaster general so he could lick me from behind on my stamps.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a Bulwark contributor. My normal partner in this enterprise, Elliot Cohen, is on a much-deserved vacation, but I'm joined today by a special guest, Timothy Ryback, the author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, which was published earlier this spring. Tim is also the co-founder and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He's been a director and vice president of the Salzburg Seminar, as well as a lecturer at Harvard. Tim, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Oh, thank you, Eric.
So I really want to talk about this book, which I found absolutely fascinating and a great read. As you and I have discussed previously, I was a graduate student at Yale in the 1970s, and Henry Ashby Turner, one of the German historians at Yale, wrote in the 70s and 80s books about Hitler's 30 Days to Power, about the role of big business and the rise of Hitler, which in some sense was an effort to sort of debunk the Marxist historiography of Hitler's rise to power. I wonder if you could tell our audience what it is that brought you to write this book and why you think it's particularly timely today.
Yeah, well, Eric, you make a very important point. There have been more books written on Hitler and his rise to power and his time in power than probably any other historical figure of the 20th century. And, there's a question about why another book on this man or this time period. Well, let me just say two things. The first is I had been teaching, as you mentioned, a course at Harvard in Weimar Nazi culture. And I actually started sensing a lot of the resonances with the contemporary political scene. And it's the job of a historian, I should say, and like Peter Gay, like Henry Ashby Turner, like Ian Kershaw, and the list goes on, Joachim Fest, to explain how we got from where we were to where we are. And that's the job of a historian. But I think what that does, it lends events and people a sense of historical inevitability, because you take those facts that help us understand the processes and the outcomes. I decided to take a completely different approach, try to forget everything I know, and instead looked at the daily press. I looked at diaries. I looked at meeting protocols, and simply began in the summer of 1932, basically 6 months before Hitler's, appointment as chancellor in January of 33, just to follow the events as the average German was experiencing them, as the press was reporting them as we go along. And in fact, when you talk about the sense of historical inevitability, it was exactly the opposite. You just realize how perilous the situation was, how uncertain the situation was. And in some ways, I guess what I'd say, we look at the last 3 or 4 weeks on the American political scene, where we've had an assassination attempt. We had one candidate withdraw. We had another candidate come in. We've watched polling numbers go crazy. No one knows what the outcome in November will be, but a week after the election, I assure you, scholars and every pundit, political scientist are going to be able to tell you why this outcome was inevitable, and taking all those facts that actually help us explain how we got to this point. And as I say, I left that aside, and this is a book not about historical inevitability, but I'd say political contingency. And I think at the end, what I myself, in researching this and writing this, was going, how did this happen? How can this man get out of this? How can we end up where we ended up? And it's really quite a dramatic ride through, and there's a lot to Hitler's personality, there's a lot to the political circumstances that contributed to it. But so I think if there's anything new to what this book might add to the scholarship, it is, I'm not sure we ever sensed how precarious Hitler's political situation was.
I think that's really one of the terrific strengths of the book, is the sense of contingency, the political peril that Hitler found himself in repeatedly during this period, because there were multiple crises of government that could have gone one way or another, and their innumerable individual decisions that you chronicle by the players that ultimately led to the outcome that we all know, that we know, but they didn't know at the time they were making these decisions, which is one of the reasons I think the book is so powerful. It really highlights the role of human agency, individual human agency in history, as opposed to just grand historical forces, which is not to say those forces didn't exist. I mean, there were obviously a backdrop to this, World War I, the way it ended, the inflation that racked Germany in the 1920s, the war debt and reparations, the restrictions imposed on Germany by the Versailles Treaty, all of these things that created this roiling political atmosphere in Germany. But it was really individuals who were key here.
Yeah. What I might add to that, Eric, Hans Frank, who is Adolf Hitler's personal attorney, was the lawyer for the Nazi Party and helped actually design the legal strategy by which the National Socialists destroyed democracy through democratic process. He went on to become, as you know, the Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, and was hanged at Nuremberg for his role in Nazi atrocity. But while he was awaiting trial and execution at Nuremberg, he made actually a really interesting observation that fits with what you just said. And he said, Hitler was only possible at this particular moment. He said, had we tried a decade earlier, when the Kaiser was still there, those structures and institutions were still there, we would not have succeeded. Had we tried a decade later, you would have had a full generation of Germans imbued with democratic values. The democratic structures would have been better formed, and we would have failed. So he said, Hitler was only possible at this particular moment. And I think there is a lot to that, to the historical moment, you can say. But as you said, you needed individuals to the agency of political actors to end up with the result that we ended up with.
I wonder if you could talk for our listeners and viewers a little bit about some of the dramatis personae in this story, because there are really a number of fascinating characters whose individual decisions, lead to all this. I mean, first and foremost, of course, is Hitler, and the entourage around him, Goebbels, Goering, Hans Frank, as you mentioned, other leading Nazis. But there were also then the pillars of the establishment, the president, Field Marshal Hindenburg, who ultimately has to make the decision to appoint Hitler as chancellor. There are his predecessors, Franz von Papen and Kurt Schleicher. There's Alfred Hugenberg, who's the head of a rival nationalist party who actually kind of loathes Hitler personally, but is kind of forced into compromise because, and again, not to put too fine a point on it, Hitler never really goes above, in terms of vote share, sort of mid-30s in the vote. So he never really has more than a third of the country behind him until 1933. Afterwards, of course, it changes. But could you talk a little bit about some of those individuals and some of the key moments where they, made the decisions that led to the outcome?
Well, I think, one thing to note about Adolf Hitler was that he really was a political outsider, and he was on the political fringes for practically the first decade of his political life, beginning in the early 1920s. First of all, he wasn't even German; he was Austrian, and it was not until February of 1932 when he decided to run for the office of president that he applied for German citizenship and got it. So, he was a pan-Germanist, but legally speaking, he was only, a German citizen beginning in February of 32. But was also, did not come from any, he was an outsider, famously, had never reached, a grade higher than corporal during the war, and on and on and on. And was seen very much, as this renegade person, pretty much inhabiting the fringes of political life, the center of political power with the individuals that you mentioned, all of whom had aristocratic titles. They all had a fun in their name. And there was a political elite, especially by 1932, you had most people in government at that point were part of the Prussian aristocracy. They were either generals, they were industrialists, they were part of what one might call sort of the swamp at that time. They traded positions. They went from one position to the next, from one cabinet post to the next. But it was pretty much this merry-go-round of political power. One of the key people you mentioned, and this is really important, is Kurt von Schleicher. Maybe doesn't get as much attention as he should. The New York Times correspondent in Berlin at the time said, anything in German politics which is impenetrable or inexplicable ultimately can be traced back to Kurt von Schleicher. Schleicher was a German general. He had worked under Hindenburg during the First World War, but by 1932, he was never in a uniform. He was always either in a tuxedo attending an event or in a business suit. I like to turn the Clausewitzian phrase around and said that, Schleicher, who was a general, saw politics as war by other means. And really, for him, it was a game. There was one cabinet member in the Pruning cabinet who had gone to visit Schleicher in his office. At that point, he was Minister of Defense. And he said there was not a scrap of paper, not a single file on Schleicher's desk. All he had were a lot of these glass figures of these figurines of animals, and it was this menagerie that he used to move around and manipulate, almost like a chess game. He said it was the same with people. He just saw himself as the man behind the scenes who manipulated individuals. Most consequentially, for the time period that we're talking about, you mentioned Franz von Papen. Schleicher, who was once again part of the aristocratic class, was seen as not a terribly astute individual. Schleicher once said that he was a handsome man, but he said, Papen's head is used for carrying a top hat rather than brains. And even when he was appointed chancellor in the spring of 1932, was pretty much seen as a Schleicher puppet. Schleicher saw him as a puppet. I think Papen himself saw himself as a Schleicher puppet. I think those were two key individuals. Alfred von Hugenberg, you mentioned, was the Rupert Murdoch of the day. He was a media mogul, had control over 1,400 newspapers across the country, and was a very wealthy industrialist who had felt like the German press was too liberal, and so created his own press empire. This was at the very beginning of the Weimar Republic, as a press counterpart, a media counterpart to what he saw as a press that was too cosmopolitan, too liberal. And he hated democracy. He practiced something called Katastrophenpolitik. He understood democracy as well as anyone. He realized that in order for democracy to function, you needed consensus. You needed a functioning majority. And he practiced something called Katastrophenpolitik, politics of catastrophe, in which he would put highly contentious issues into the public space, sometimes fake news stories. My favorite one of his was that he put out the story that the German government was enslaving German teenagers and selling them abroad to the Allies to service the German war debt imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Another issue, he got a public referendum out there that said that any signatory to the Treaty of Versailles and any government official who had helped implement the provisions of Versailles should be tried for treason and executed. And what his goal, his purpose there was not so much to get one particular issue on the agenda, but in fact to hollow out the political center, to force people to have an opinion on an issue and hollow out the center, polarize the political system. And he felt that by its own weight, the democratic system would collapse. So that was Hugenberg playing his own game there. But then we finally come to Hindenburg, who ultimately, he was president of the country, popularly elected, a revered, iconic figure. He was the one who held the entire country together, was a monarchist at heart, but his love for his country, for Germany writ large, was such that he agreed to run for president in 1925, had already been in retirement. He had actually gone into retirement before World War I, came into service to help Germany fight the war. After the war, went back into retirement, then came out again out of retirement in 1925, intended to serve one term to help the country get stabilized, and then in the spring of 1932, intended to retire finally. He was 84 years old at the time. Hitler decided to run for president, and Hindenburg realized he was the only person who could hold the center, and so was forced to run again. 7-year term. I mean, essentially a death sentence in office when he did one. He beat Hitler by 6 million votes. And so he was this commanding figure. And most importantly for our discussions, Article 53 of the Constitution gave him the power to appoint and dismiss chancellors at will. And so ultimately, he was doing whatever he could to keep the Weimar Republic as much as I guess as ambivalent as he was about democracy writ large. He saw his duty as president of the country to adhere to the Constitution. One critic of him said that Hindenburg read the Constitution the way a field officer read a field manual, doing it point by point. But those were the three. Those were sort of, I think, the key players. And what I might that's probably enough.
I'd like to go into Hindenburg a little bit because part of the dramatic tension in your narrative is Hindenburg's contempt, really, for the Hitler, who after all was a corporal when Hindenburg was a field marshal. He really holds Hitler in absolute contempt, and it's clear throughout that he doesn't want to make Hitler chancellor. He really is opposed to this, even though his son seems to be more ambivalent or open to the idea of making Hitler chancellor. But through a series of political crises, some of them artificially created, in 32, 33, he gets worn down and ultimately decides to, that Hitler can be managed, that he can be contained, that it won't do too much damage. Maybe it'll actually even domesticate Hitler by having to have the responsibility, the reins of government in his hands, or that other forces can keep him in check, which of course turns out to be a catastrophic misjudgment. But can you talk a little bit about that process of how Hindenburg came to the point of finally agreeing to make Hitler chancellor, again, despite the fact that Hitler does not have a majority, in Germany?
Yeah. Hindenburg's disdain for Hitler is profound and sincere, I guess you could say. The shorthand version is, Hindenburg famously referred to him as that Bohemian corporal. This, Austrian, from the backwoods, confronting this Prussian aristocrat, this, the great field marshal, the heroic figure, iconic figure of the First World War. But it is deeper than that, as you said, Eric, and it goes back further. It was Kurt von Schleicher early on when Hitler's movement was rising. Schleicher thought that Hindenburg should meet with Hitler. So he arranged this meeting. Hitler went in and ranted for half hour, 45 minutes. And, Hindenburg was very polite. He walked out. And Hindenburg afterwards said, "Who was that man? I never want to see him again." But in the course of the, those, as the Nazis became more and more prominent, Hitler had several other meetings with Hindenburg. The most crucial one being in the summer of 1932, when the Nazis got their high water mark, 37% of the votes, the single largest party in the Reichstag, represented there, and traditionally the head of the largest party was appointed chancellor. You put together a coalition that reached 51% or plus. Hitler was marched in to see, once again by Schleicher, was marched in to see Hindenburg, and Hindenburg basically told Hitler to his face, "I would never appoint you as chancellor. You're divisive toward the toward the public. Politically, Hitler's hatred of the Jews bothered Hindenburg very deeply, and Hindenburg basically dismissed him and said, "For the sake of God, my country, and my conscience, I would never appoint you as chancellor." Afterward, he allegedly quipped to someone that if he was to appoint Hitler as anything, it would be as postmaster general so he could lick me from behind on my stamps. So that is how, and so this is where we are in July of 32, or no, August, well, I guess then we're August of 32. But as you say, by the end of January, we suddenly find Hindenburg in the meeting actually with Schleicher and Von Papen, a series of meetings. What had happened is Papen became chancellor. Hitler said, if you're not going to appoint me chancellor, we're going to go into opposition. I will gridlock the legislative process and basically make the Reichstag non-functioning. It had to be dissolved. Hindenburg was forced to dissolve it. And once again, through politics, but also through personality, Von Papen remains the most unpopular chancellor in German history. I forget what the percentages were, but it's barely, very low 2 digits, if not single digit. I mean, he was just unpopular. Hindenburg actually liked him, was forced then to dismiss him and appoint Schleicher as chancellor. And so Schleicher, who's been actually behind the scenes the whole time, suddenly finds himself as chancellor in the position of power. Papen then goes behind von Schleicher's back and starts negotiating with Hitler with the idea that he goes in and he's meeting secretly with Hindenburg on this and basically says, look, if you want to get this functioning again, I can help Hitler build a coalition of conservative parties. We'll get the 51% that you want, and we will appoint Hitler as chancellor. I will serve as vice chancellor. One of the operative phrases was, we'll box Hitler in, and within a month we'll have him in such a tight corner he will squeak. And that's basic. And so Hindenburg said, you mean I have to appoint this man? And he did so on the condition that he would never be left alone in a room with Hitler. So on January 11 o'clock in the morning, on January 30th, Hitler was appointed chancellor. I guess the rest is history. But it was, what it was a number of people thinking that they could outsmart Hitler, could outthink him, also not taking his rhetoric as seriously as it was. They believed that once he was in power, the operative phrase at that time was, soup is never eaten as hot as it's cooked. And so once Hitler found himself as chancellor in a responsible position, he would moderate.
I want to turn to sort of the kind of weakening of the institutions of democracy during Weimar, and then ultimately the sequel to what we just discussed, which was the passage of the Enabling Act that allows Hitler basically within 6 months to create a personal dictatorship out of a democracy. But I do want to just touch briefly on the role of the business community. You mentioned some of that a bit earlier in the conversation, but there was this Marxist sort of historiography that said Hitler was the tool of the bourgeois industrialists, and they put him in power, and this is classic explanation of fascism. Henry Turner, whose book you cite and rely on in parts of your book, sort of made it clear that that was a way oversimplified view of what happened. But could you discuss a little bit about how did the business community sort of, react to all this, and what role did they play in the rise of Hitler?
Okay. I will. One comment though on the Bolshevism Marxism version of this. My favorite review of my book is also the most scathing, which was by the Socialist Worker in the UK, and it's this long screed about how Ryback failed to understand the class struggle in his book. He underplayed it, and then brought up all these quotes by Trotsky undermining my argument, and it's wonderful. Though I have to say, there is that element in I think something that's important to mention is the threat of Bolshevism at the time. And you have to understand, this is in the German conscience. You have Stalin in Moscow. They are feeding arms and they're feeding financing into the Communist Party. And it is it's a political threat. It's also a physical threat. I mean, they are arming themselves. There is an underground army. There's regular violence in the streets on this. And, they're polling, in elections, they're getting, north of 20%, which is playing a significant role on the political scene. So there was the Bolshevik threat. The conservatives, the industrialists, basically were backing the traditional centrist parties, the conservative centrist parties in Germany. A lot of money was going to Alfred Hugenberg, the mogul, to support his party, which was generally sort of the fourth largest party. I mean, you had the Social Democrats, you had the Communists, you had the National Socialists, and then you had the German Nationalist Party, which was Hugenberg's party. Did not poll as well as the others, but nevertheless was a significant political force. But the industrialists, all except for maybe Thyssen, actually kept a distance from Hitler. Through Hugenberg, he was actually he was financing Hitler's movement, but could turn the tap on and off. The relationship between Hitler and Hugenberg was colossally contentious. And in the book, I mean, some of these things are laugh out loud, when you see these confrontations between the two men. But until the last minute, the industrialists really were not there. And what one has to realize is, Hitler was, he was playing for broke by late 1932. When he marched out of Hindenburg's office, and he said, "Okay, you won't take me for 30. I need 51%. I'll get 51%." So he goes into the next election, spends a colossal amount of money campaigning. He leases a Lufthansa airplane. He covers the whole, canvasses the entire country, is showing up in villages and towns that most German politicians had never even heard of, and moves toward the November 1932 election, claiming that he has canvassed the country. The National Socialists are going to win by a landslide. In fact, they lose 2 million votes. He goes from 37% down to 33%. The party has internal divisions. There was somebody who plays a key role there that's in some ways been forgotten by history is Gregor Strasser, who was equal to Hitler in terms of the party. They were sort of the yin and yang. Hitler was the nationalist. Strasser was the true socialist. But you had these tensions within the party. It was bankrupt. They were on the verge of collapse. And what happens is some conversations take place. Once again, this concern about Bolshevik revolution, concern about the center holding, or not the center, but the conservative right holding. And that's when a meeting takes place in early January where a man named Schröder, a banker, basically gives Hitler a credit line up to 30 million marks. At that point, it's estimated that there were 90 million marks in debt, which is, literally today's dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. So the Nazi Party by early January was bankrupt politically. They were hemorrhaging membership, and they were bankrupt financially, and in some senses ideologically, because Strasser was threatening to split the party itself. But it was this meeting with this industrialist in Schröder where they began to put something together, and frankly had that, and they maneuvered, von Papen maneuvered Schleicher out of office, and that's when Schleicher went in, he felt confident because he said, well, I'm the last horse in Hindenburg's stall. He doesn't have anyone else left. And, in some ways, and this is my feeling, had Hindenburg just given Schleicher another 6 months, the Nazi Party, first of all, Hitler had the support of the industrialists at that moment. Had he not been appointed chancellor, they would have backed off. The country, the economy was beginning to stabilize. A lot of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles had been renegotiated, and had the Weimar Republic had another 6 months, the outcome would have been completely different. And this goes back to the Hans Frank thing. It was only at this moment that Hitler was possible.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the weakening of the institutions of Weimar that, set this moment kind of in motion. And you kind of adverted to it earlier. The violence, the street violence that, seemed to be kind of endemic throughout this period, but intensifying in the the late 20s, early 30s. I mean, I think the book actually begins with the killing of some communist activists by Nazi paramilitary group that creates a series of trials that are very controversial for Hitler. But the sort of the breakdown of law and order, the concern about ongoing street violence. I mean, this, in some sense, was one of Stalin's and the Bolsheviks, great misjudgments, which was rather than having a united front, which is what they decided to have later in the 30s in other European countries, they labeled the Social Democrats as social fascists, and said there is no difference really between Hitler and the Social Democrats. They stand for the same things, and engaging in this sort of street violence with the SA and with other sort of paramilitary elements of Nazism, they really sort of set the stage for what comes later, which is Hitler saying, "I need these extraordinary powers to stop all this." Do you have any thoughts about that? Because that also, one of the things about reading your book is the number of times that as you read it, you feel, as you were saying earlier, there's all this resonance with things that have been going on here. With concerns about crime because of the border, and they defund the police and the violence around George Floyd. I mean, some of this is very, very redolent of what's happened here. I mean, the actors obviously are different, but the social forces in some sense are very similar.
Well, this is this issue of this radicalization of the polarization. This is, one of the resonances I see, between Weimar and Americas. this Hugenberg use of wedge issues to polarize America, to polarize, the Weimar Republic, to make democracy unsustainable. And I think but 2 points specifically. Let me first start with the talk about street violence. The newspapers were publishing what they were calling casualty lists in the country's ongoing civil war, because the number of there were daily shootings. It was mostly confrontations between National Socialists and Social Democrats, but also communists. So you had sort of this three-way street battles going on, and it is important what you said, Eric, that this divisiveness, between the left forces, had the communists and social democrats really been able to form a coalition and gotten some additional centrist parties, you would have had a completely different scenario. But you did have street violence and gun violence, and part of it was the proliferation of weapons. And there was a cabinet meeting in August of 1932 where they're trying to figure out how to introduce gun control legislation. And there are all of these proposals, where there was actually a mayor in a North German city was introducing a program to buy back weapons from people, where you could trade them in if you'd committed. There were all of these different scenarios. What they had proposed was actually a fairly draconian system, which is that anyone involved in a political murder would actually be tried and executed. The objection to that was that it would basically turn the German courts into killing machines, because there were just so many, there's so many acts of violence. There was, in fact, and this is the second point, you mentioned there was a foreign worker in a village called Potempa who was basically kicked to death by 9 Nazis and other right-wing people. They had targeted a number of people in town, and there was this sense of immunity. First of all, Hitler had his 37%. The assumption was he was going to be chancellor, and so these guys took free rein. They walked into this guy's house in front of his mother. They kicked him to death, and they kicked him, into unconsciousness, and then put a bullet in him. In fact, what he died of, he choked to death on his own blood. The trial, there were 6 of these people who were involved with this perpetrators, ended up being put on trial and were accused of it and sentenced to death. Hitler came out with a political statement. He didn't say there were good guys on both sides, but he did say these are good people. More importantly, they're Germans. And when I am chancellor, never will a foreign life be put above that of a blood German. Now, what I need to say is, this is Hitler talking to his base. This was in the run-up to that November election. This is part of the reason why he lost votes. A lot of Germans looked at this and were horrified by it. But I think what Hitler understood was the power of his base. Even whether it's his 33% or 37%, he knew if he had the majority of sort of a relative majority of the absolute majority, he could actually cudgel, co-opt everybody else sort of into, to his will, which actually happened. His operative phrase at that time was 37% is 75% of 51%. And with that, we have complete political power.
Political math. Tim, I want to turn in the time remaining to what to me is one of the most powerful resonances of the period you discuss and our contemporary moment, and that is the critique of liberalism and liberal democracy. Because we've talked about the weakening of the institutions of Weimar and the role that Hindenburg played, but Hitler very explicitly, and others like Hugenberg, as you mentioned, either explicitly or implicitly, were suggesting that liberal democracy had failed, and that it could not succeed. And there is a very explicit, politico-legal theory behind all of this, and a theorist in particular, which was Carl Schmitt. And there's a lot of resonance with what you hear from some of the people who support Donald Trump, notably including his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who has raised in a variety of fora questions about how well democracy works, and Peter Thiel, who is his who is basically Vance's patron in the world of venture capital in Silicon Valley, has also not only raised questions publicly where he says, I'm not sure democracy works anymore, but he's also specifically cited Carl Schmitt. And I wonder if you would, want to talk a little bit about that, the role that the critique of liberalism played in both weakening the institutions, ultimately overthrowing them in Germany, leading to the rise of dictatorship, and the way that might, at least, if not history repeating itself, at least history, as Mark Twain said, rhyming.
Yeah. Okay. Let me answer that in this order. First, Hitler's opinion on it, then Carl Schmitt, and then maybe Peter Thiel. Hitler's problem with what he stated publicly about what he despised about democracy, parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy. He said, basically, these Reichstag delegates can come into the Reichstag, they can pass legislation, they can pass budgets, they can sign things like the Treaty of Versailles, they can commit the country to all kinds of, put all these burdens on the country. And then when their term is up, they can walk off. And there's no accountability, there's no response. They can destroy the country, and there's no one to hold them accountable. And, in some ways, you can vote in Congress for whatever you want to do. You can, put the country into trillions of dollars in debt. And, when your term is up, you go back to, Illinois or Arizona or wherever, but no one's going to come after you to collect on that bill that you put on the country. So, Hitler's objection to parliamentary democracy was that this whole issue of accountability, his point was, I will be in charge, and the Führer has complete responsibility and ultimate accountability. When he did fail at the very end, he put a bullet in his head. He should have done that much sooner. But in any event, so I think that was in some ways sort of his philosophical, if you can talk about that, approach to it. This is why I hated it. Carl Schmitt came at it.
I alone can fix it.
Well, I alone can think exactly, and this is where, and Carl Schmitt comes at it very much the same way. And Schmitt he wrote the book that everyone's citing. The Carl Schmitt is called "The Concept of the Political," which he wrote, keep in mind, in 1932. Okay, there was this earlier version, and what he basically talks about is this polarization process that had already begun in the Weimar Republic. And his basic thesis is there are friends and enemies. That's all there can be. It's Freund, Feind. You will always be in a state of war. There will always be a state of conflict. There can only be one victor, one authority over this. And so that's where I think, he came in and he basically said, look, we gave democracy a 13-year run. It's proven that it has failed. And that's where he was coming from. I think as interesting as that is, which gets cited a little more if we're looking for resonances or parallels, I was struck by this Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. Carl Schmitt also had something to say that. I have that with me because I show it to, for the last 3 weeks, I carry this with me and I show it to everyone. But this was a 3-page essay that Schmitt wrote in July of 1934. And this was after the Night of the Long Knives. And it is giving a legal justification for Hitler's murdering of all of his political opponents. And it goes back to this Hitler notion of authority and responsibility. And his argument was that as head of state, as head of the government, your ultimate responsibility is to the safety of the country. And you bear that responsibility. You also have the authority. So you are the ultimate judge in this system above the existing legal system. And in some way, not in some ways, and this was his it was a legal justification. And he marches through, he takes all the, articles from the Constitution, he picks this thing apart, and he simply gives a legal justification for political murder. And in some ways, the resonance is, and I'm not saying that there will be political murder in America, but he was basically saying Hitler, as chancellor, as head of state with this responsibility, is immune from any prosecution because he is the ultimate authority. He's also the ultimate judge. Where Peter Thiel, I'm sorry, did you?
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. And this is where, enter Peter Thiel, who, has invoked Carl Schmitt's name. And I actually feel like I should send Peter Thiel a copy of my book because he talks about the fact that there are these resonances between America today and Weimar Germany. And he said in Weimar, after 13 years, democracy had finally exhausted itself. And in at least one interview I've heard, he basically brings forth the same proposition. He says, has democracy simply exhausted itself? It's a political fatigue of the system. Is it Schleicher saying the last horse in the stall? Are we at the end of things? So I think it's interesting that Peter Thiel, as a businessman, but with sort of this real historical consciousness. But I think there are other lessons to draw from Weimar Germany and its failure, and I tend to look at the lost possibilities there. And as I say, had Weimar had an extra 6 months, I think history would have been completely different.
That's probably a good note for us to end on, Tim. I would just observe that the us-them dichotomy that Schmitt draws and on which certainly you can see echoed in some of J.D. Vance's comments, not to mention Peter Thiel's comment that freedom and democracy can't coexist anymore, I think really cut to the core of what has made the American experiment in democracy so unique and successful. And Daniel Boorstin long ago said that in the 50s wrote that the genius of American politics, unlike other countries in Europe and around the world was that Americans had found the ability to compromise and to not allow political differences to make legislatures dysfunctional. And that's certainly also, I would say, the gravamen of, for instance, President Lincoln's second inaugural address, in which he says that we cannot be enemies among Americans. And so I think, as you say, there are a lot of lessons to be taken from this very compact 1-year period in German history, and I certainly hope that some of our listeners and viewers will go out and read your book and hopefully draw the right lessons. So thank you so much for joining us today on Shield of the Republic.